Hello, one more time, all. Dr. JC here. Week 16. Week 16. We're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the Cold War. This is the jockeying between the Western world, largely capitalist world, and those forces that embrace communism, led by Stalin in Russia and Mao Zedong in China. And as part of that Cold War, we'll focus on the Berlin airlift, forming of NATO, in the United States, the creation of this National Security Council, new theories such as the containment theory, and then we'll spend a brief amount of time too talking about the Korean War, Korean conflict, to include its linkages to present day. Obviously, Korea, most especially North Korea, much in the news. Now, like the World War II lectures in weeks 14, 15, this one as well will be redone during the summer, so I'll apologize if the information's a little bit brief and perhaps a little choppy, but I did want to provide some audio background to the more static PowerPoint version that's already in the course. With that, let's jump right into week 16 here. One more week. Stay alert, stay alive. Almost immediately after World War II ends, peace is signed on the USS Missouri, victory in the Pacific is achieved. The West begins to look for ways to go ahead and combat or contain communism. In Europe, eyes turn to Joseph Stalin to see if he's going to live up to his commitment to open and free elections in Eastern Europe. That's not going to happen. And thus, by March of 1946, former Prime Minister Winston Churchill will not retain his position at 10 Downing Street after the war. Churchill is on a tour of the United States. And on March the 5th, 1946, at Westminster College in Fulton, Missouri, he delivers a speech with Harry Truman present that becomes remembered to history as the Iron Curtain speech. While I won't go into the details of the speech here, I will include a link to the Winston Churchill Society's site that includes an article and a link to the speech itself. It is important to note that it's here in this speech that Churchill really does outline not just need for and collaboration between the United States and Great Britain, but perhaps a larger block of nations that believe in open elections, believe in a capitalist economic system that can together lend weight and credence to contain the spread of communism. While Churchill's speech here did begin to frame a post-war understanding and perhaps narrative in the United States, it helped the Truman administration do that about a new fight, the fight to protect the world from communism, at least in the eyes of the West. This was anything but new, this discussion about containment, to folks inside the administration. And in fact, we have good record of that as early as February the 22nd, to be specific, of 1946, what historians refer to today as George Kennan's long telegram, where George Kennan was the ambassador to Russia, and he wrote a lengthy analysis of Russian or Soviet policy to the Secretary of State, giving insight into their more recent, utterly uncooperative behavior, and laying out this idea or theory of containment. Thus, Kennan's long telegram becomes associated with this containment doctrine, or part of a larger Truman doctrine. Akin to Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, I've also included in the classroom resources a link to the Wilson Center, where you can read Kennan's long telegram itself. As mentioned on this slide, the strategy of containment, therefore, isn't just to limit Soviet expansionism, but it's also meant to limit the spread of communism globally by other nations or agencies or entities as well, such as Mao Zedong's regime in China. With the Truman Doctrine in mind, understand that Truman kind of outlined this larger doctrine. On March the 12th, 1947, he gave a speech before a joint session of Congress, and in it he kind of laid out the 4 pillars that I have listed on this slide. In addition to the expansion of NATO to help check Russian expansionism in Europe, The United States would continue support for the United Nations. They would provide funding for underdeveloped nations, specifically the transference of technology and technological understanding, largely because it's in these underdeveloped nations that seem to be the most fertile ground for communism to begin to take root. And lastly, an aggressive approach to making sure that this Marshall Plan worked to its fullest extent in Europe. Now, just as Winston Churchill had long called George Marshall the quote-unquote organizer of victory during World War II because he served as the chief of staff under FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and Harry Truman, so a known entity to the Allies for sure, he became Secretary of State and Defense under Truman. And it was while he was Secretary of State that they came up with this plan known as the Marshall Plan. And I would invite and encourage you guys to read more about it because I'm just obviously going to give you the basics here. To not do a 2.0 Treaty of Versailles. Germans are not going to be hung out to dry this go-round, nor for that matter are any Europeans that at this point don't belong to the Soviet Union, nor are any underdeveloped peoples throughout the globe going to go without U.S. support. The United States was going to open its checkbook to help all peoples rise and at the same time contain communism. Communism would not spread from where it already existed. In order to help coordinate all these efforts, in 1947, the United States passed the National Security Act. Very important. Would ask everybody to take a look at it, research it a little bit more. As briefly detailed and outlined on this slide here, the National Security Act will create the Department of Defense. It was formerly known as the Department of War. Will establish the National Security Council, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and most importantly, this thing called the CIA, or Central Intelligence Agency. The United States will aggressively go after communism in any and all ways and shapes and forms. We're going to use the pen if we need to, and, at times, if required, the sword. But any and everything will be used in our arsenal of democracy, would say the United States, to limit the expansion and threat that is communism. One of the first tests to the resolve of the West by Stalin was his institution of the blockade of Berlin, which began on June 24, 1948. Yeah, you Westerners have big talk, says Joe Stalin. Let's see how big talk is. National Security Act, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, let's see what y'all got. I'm going to test you. I'm going to test your Marshall Plan. Stalin will quickly find out that Western resolve is there, that the United States is not going to be sitting on the sidelines anymore. They are going to take an active role and part in what goes on in the larger global world, to include specifically Europe, and in this case Berlin. Western nations will respond with this massive effort to help folks in West Berlin, known as the Berlin Airlift. I outline it briefly here on this slide. I would ask everybody to Google it. And as a result of these efforts by the West, eventually Stalin has to back off and calls an end to the blockade of Berlin. Just before the end of that blockade, and there's no way the Western nations would have known that, in April of 1949, they established this North Atlantic Treaty Organization, what we know today as NATO. NATO was a mutual defense treaty. It was a way to deal with an expansionist Russia. The banding together, at least initially, of 12 member states saying, look, Joe, Stalin, if you want to go ahead and pick on one of us, you're going to pick on a whole hell of a lot of us. So think twice, brother. And you know we mean business, bro. Look at the Berlin Airlift. We ain't playing, homie. NATO members also recognized they had a little something to back up some of their talk: atomic weaponry. And at least until August of 1949, this type of rhetoric could hold the Stalins of the world in check. That's going to change, however, in August of 1949. The first of what would be several successful Soviet atomic tests. First Lightning, the Russians referred to it. In the West, they called it Joe 1, takes place. And the awesome and destructive power and capability that is atomic weaponry that the West thought only they had understood and perfected, now quickly realizes that in the arsenal of communism, they have this destructive capability as well. And thus began this new militarism or arms race, the stockpiling of these atomic warheads. Yet both sides recognizing and perhaps applying this mad theory. Do you really want to use them? Because if you start lobbing these at one another, is it really mutually assured destruction? Madness. And while both sides would continue to stockpile the atomic weaponry, it was still conventional arms that were used on the field of battle. And in June of 1950, a new field of battle emerged. North Korea invades South Korea, and a larger proxy war between communism and capitalism will take place. And most folks throughout the world recognize and hope that this isn't another Spanish Civil War, where we saw a proxy war take place that turned into a larger global conflagration. Was this to be World War III? Rather than get into the details of the Korean conflict here, I'd ask that you research that yourselves. And by the way, I refer to it as a conflict and like to do so because the United States Congress never formally declared war here. Rather, President Truman acted through the United Nations. And in fact, for those that might be interested in more ultra-modern history, present history, the United States Congress last formally declared war on someone in 1942. So we'll save the discussion about presidential power, whether they be R's or D's, their political affiliation, and their use or authorization of military force or war powers for a different time and a different discussion altogether. Rather, what I'd like to do here with Korea is lay the groundwork as to why the conflict took place and where that leads Korea and the United States at present. Historically, the last we left the Koreans, they had been annexed during the Meiji years in the early 1910s, 1911. They became part of the Empire of Japan. And as mentioned previously, part of the U.S. calculus to use atomic weaponry to get Japan to tap out of the war was because of Russia's advance in the East. They were moving down the Korean Peninsula. And once Japan had tapped out formally and officially, the United States and Russia had to try to figure out how are we going to divvy up the Korean Peninsula here. And with a little bit of horse trading, they kind of settled on this 38th parallel. And over time, with neither side willing to bend or give up more terrain, Korea, for all intents and purposes, remained divided at this 38th parallel. And thus, in June of 1950, with the backing of Russia and China, Communist North Korea, Pyongyang its center, drives south into South Korea. They would like to annex or take over the entire peninsula. The United Nations, not necessarily wanting to be seen as the League of Nations 2.0, decides to call for action. The United States and other nations will answer the call. They will send military troops. President Truman will authorize action in concert with the United Nations, not the U.S. Congress. Again, we'll save that for a different discussion. And after years of conflict, to include U.S. generals like MacArthur calling for the use of atomic weaponry during the conflict. By the way, he will get fired for that by Truman. Both sides will land pretty damn near where they all started, at the same parallel. And perhaps for those of you who have served in Korea, you know about this DMZ, or Demilitarized Zone. It was established in July of 1953 when a formal truce, not an outright treaty to end this thing, was established. Therefore, the Korean conflict, the negotiations that continue to go on today between the United States and North Korea and other governing bodies in the area, to include the South Koreans, are in a technical sense looking for a way to formally end this conflict. And while time doesn't allow for us to completely expand upon or expound on this Cold War, and many of you may know the history already anyway because it's much more present, whether it be the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 1960s, American involvement in Southeast Asia, Vietnam in the 1970s, Strategic Defense Initiative, or Star Wars as it was called during the Reagan years, this Velvet Revolution in Eastern Europe where U.S. rock and roll helped folks like Václav Havel in the Czech Republic pull down that Iron Curtain and end the Soviet Union. All important parts of a story that I would ask that you guys go ahead and read more about on your own. I did want to take a moment here to say thanks to everybody for the course here, for your attention the last 16 weeks. I'm hoping that there was more than one or two aspects of the course, various pieces of the lectures that piqued your interest. If they did, I would encourage you to read more on those areas. And I'd also wish everybody much continued success, not just on your impending final exams as we head toward final exam week, but success in your career paths ahead, to include especially those of you that are getting ready to start that career path once this term ends. But for all of you, I love for you to continue to apply the old adage Dr. JC has hammered home here. And what's that? Stay alert, baby. Stay alive. Dr. JC out. Thanks again to all. Much continued success for everyone in the future.